The dust in the archive was not merely the settled residue of years, but felt like the powdered remains of forgotten things, of truths deliberately buried. It coated the air, the ancient folios, the very light that struggled through the high, grimy windows, lending the place the atmosphere of a charnel house where history itself had been interred. It was here, amidst the brittle pages and the scent of decay, that my obsession took root, a slow, creeping dread born from the margins of official histories, the hushed footnotes, and the sheer, inexplicable silence surrounding certain names, certain reigns. They were not difficult to find, not truly. Their existence was undeniable, etched into lineage charts and state portraits, however flattering. But the truth of them, the grotesque reality that pulsed beneath the gilded surface of monarchy, was scattered like bone fragments, hidden in private correspondence, physicians' hurried notes, or the bewildered accounts of foreign ambassadors. My work began as a simple academic curiosity, a study of royal health and its impact on governance. It quickly devolved into something far darker, a descent into a poisoned well, seeking the source of a peculiar, persistent taint that seemed to afflict the highest branches of certain dynastic trees. I speak of the four, not the most famous, perhaps nor the most conventionally tyrannical, but the most unsettling, the ones whose very beings seemed to defy natural law, whose physical forms and fractured minds whispered of a profound error at the heart of their bloodlines. History, written by the victors and the sycophants, had done its best to smooth over the jagged edges of their existence, to explain away the deformities, the fits, the vacant stares, the bodies that seemed less like products of human generation, and more like cruel, divine jests. They were described with euphemisms, delicate constitutions, melancholic humors, childlike innocence that lingered unnervingly into adulthood. But the deeper I delved, the more the euphemisms peeled away, revealing a core of something fundamentally, tragically wrong. It wasn't just illness. Illness was common enough among the cloistered and the privileged. This was something else. A signature, repeated across centuries and kingdoms, of a biological debt coming due. A price paid for generations of carefully curated purity, for the incestuous preservation of power and property within an ever-tightening circle. The consequences were whispered about in their own time, though never openly acknowledged by the court. Tales of limbs that grew at unnatural angles, of faces that seemed unfinished, of minds that drifted in perpetual twilight or flared with terrifying, unpredictable rages. My research became a hunt. Not for facts, the facts were often deliberately obscured, but for the feeling of it, the pervasive sense of unease that clung to their reins like a shroud. Why were the records of their early years so sparse? Why the conflicting accounts of their deaths? Why the immediate, almost frantic effort to present their successors as paragons of health and vigor? It was more than just the usual propaganda. It felt like the desperate act of scrubbing away a stain, of burying a secret so profound, so shameful, that its mere acknowledgement threatened to unravel the very fabric of their authority. I began to piece together the fragments, cross-referencing obscure medical texts with court diaries, ambassadorial reports with the rare, unfiltered letters that escaped the censors. And as the picture began to form, a chilling pattern emerged. These four, separated by time and geography, shared not just the superficial markers of their shared ancestry, but a deeper, more fundamental fragility. Their stories were not just tales of personal suffering, but of a systemic rot, a consequence so horrific that it had to be erased from the collective memory. A crime against nature committed in the name of divine right and dynastic pride. And the deeper I delved into their shadowed lives, the more I began to suspect that their afflictions were not just unfortunate accidents of birth, but deliberate, if unintended, consequences of a history built on a foundation of forbidden unions. The truth, I was discovering, was far more unsettling than simple misfortune. It felt like a curse, meticulously, painstakingly engineered across generations, and the archive, with its silent, dusty shelves, felt less like a repository of knowledge and more like a tomb, holding secrets that still had the power to chill the blood. The air in the archive was thick with the scent of decay and forgotten lives, a tangible weight pressing down on me. Each breath felt like inhaling the dust of centuries, the silent screams of those whose stories lay entombed here. The initial shock had given way to a cold, focused dread, This wasn't just a collection of family records. It was a meticulously curated narrative of ruin, each brittle page a brick in the wall of a generational prison. I began sifting through the earliest ledgers, the heavy vellum, stiff and reluctant to yield its secrets. Names blurred, dates swam, but patterns began to emerge, faint at first, then stark and undeniable. The forbidden unions weren't random acts of passion or rebellion. They were deliberate, recurring, often involving individuals from outside the known social circles, sometimes even from families explicitly marked as unclean or other in accompanying notes. But it wasn't just the social transgression that chilled me. It was the context. These unions were frequently followed by periods of unusual prosperity, sudden acquisitions of land or wealth juxtaposed against cryptic entries detailing strange illnesses, disappearances, or inexplicable misfortunes befalling other branches of the family. Those who had adhered to tradition, then I found it. Tucked within a bundle of 17th century correspondence was a small, unbound collection of sketches and notes. The sketches were crude, depicting figures in ceremonial robes, engaged in what looked like rituals under moonlit skies. The notes, written in a spidery, almost illegible hand, spoke of the exchange, the binding, and the price paid in blood and spirit. There was a recurring symbol, a twisted knot resembling a serpent devouring its own tail, marked repeatedly next to mentions of the forbidden unions and the subsequent boons. This wasn't just social history. It hinted at something far older, far darker, rooted in practices that had no place in the official family lineage. Further digging unearthed conflicting accounts of the curse. Some journals, particularly those written by pious family members, described it as divine retribution for defying God's law through these unions. Others, often from more pragmatic or cynical writers, spoke of a pact or agreement made long ago, the terms of which were now being enforced upon subsequent generations. One particularly disturbing diary entry from the late 18th century detailed a recurring nightmare shared by several family members, a vision of a figure demanding a tithe from the bloodline, a payment for past transgressions, or, horrifyingly, for past gains. The entry ended abruptly, the ink smudged as if the writer had been interrupted or overcome. The most unsettling discovery came from a ledger detailing births and deaths. Alongside the expected records were annotations in a different hand, often decades later. These annotations weren't about lineage, they were clinical observations. Subject displays, symbol of the twisted, not sensitivity, aversion to sunlight. Noted unusual longevity, frailty observed. These weren't medical notes. They felt like ... monitoring, as if someone or something was keeping track of the bloodline, assessing the quality or purity of its members based on criteria utterly alien to conventional understanding. And the individuals marked with these annotations were almost exclusively descendants of the forbidden lines. The archive wasn't just a record of a curse, it was a record of its management, of something watching, waiting, perhaps even guiding these unions across centuries for a purpose I couldn't yet grasp. The truth wasn't just unsettling, it was actively malevolent, a shadow stretching from the distant past into the present, its cold grip tightening around my own life. The dust motes dancing in the faint light seemed less like particles and more like watchful eyes, confirming that the secrets held within these walls were far from dormant. They were merely waiting for the right moment to reveal their full, terrifying power. The cold wasn't merely a lack of heat, it was a presence, a deliberate chill that seemed to seep into the very marrow of my bones, carrying with it the weight of forgotten scenes. The air grew heavy, thick with an oppressive silence that swallowed even the distant creaks of the old house. It wasn't the silence of emptiness, but of held breath, of something vast and ancient listening intently. Driven by a morbid curiosity that warred with a growing dread, I moved deeper into the house, the floorboards groaning beneath my weight like reluctant witnesses. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the air itself thickened with resistance. I found myself drawn to a small, neglected study, the door ajar, revealing a room cloaked in perpetual twilight inside. They danced, not randomly, but in slow, deliberate patterns, almost like a coded language I couldn't decipher. On a heavy, claw-footed desk, A single object lay exposed, a tarnished silver locket. Unlike anything else in the room's decaying grandeur, it was intricately carved with symbols I didn't recognize, archaic and unsettling. Hinting at origins far older than the house itself, picking it up sent a jolt through my hand. A cold that was sharper, more intense than the ambient chill. It felt wrong, imbued with a residual energy that prickled my skin. As I turned it over, I noticed a faint inscription on the back, almost worn away, for the keeping of the price. The words were nonsensical, yet they resonated with a deep, buried fear I couldn't explain. Further investigation of the desk revealed a hidden compartment beneath a loose panel. Inside wasn't treasure, but a bundle of brittle, yellowed letters tied with a faded ribbon. They were addressed to someone named Eleanor, from a Thomas dated decades before the official records claimed the house was built. The content of the letters was fragmented. The dark Thomas spoke of strange occurrences, of shadows that moved on their own, of whispers that drove men mad, and of a growing hunger within the very stones of the place. But the most disturbing detail was a recurring mention of a specific date, one that coincided precisely with a local legend I'd dismissed as folklore, the tale of the lost gathering, leaving behind only overturned carts and an unnatural silence. Yet, the official historical accounts of the area made no mention of Thomas or Eleanor, placing the first permanent settlement much later. The letters were a tangible contradiction, a voice from a past that shouldn't exist, detailing Thomas's intention to pay the final price. The air in the study grew impossibly cold. That felt ancient, patient, and utterly terrifyingly alive. It was the sound of something stirring, something that had been waiting, and my presence, my investigation, had just announced that the wait was over. They were actively reaching out, their cold grip tightening, pulling me deeper into the darkness they held. The ancient sound, or perhaps more accurately, the feeling of it, didn't just resonate in my bones. It seemed to vibrate the very air around me, a low thrumming that made the dust motes dance in the weak beam of my lantern. It wasn't a sound I heard with my ears, but one I felt in my teeth, in the soles of my feet, a deep, resonant frequency that spoke of immense age and slumbering power. My breath hitched, and a cold sweat prickled my skin. The academic detachment I'd cultivated over years of sifting through dead histories shattered, replaced by a primal urge to flee back into the mundane world and pretend I'd never felt this place breathe. But the grip was already tightening. It wasn't physical, not yet, but a psychic pressure, a palpable awareness that settled upon me like a shroud. I was seen. Fighting down the panic, I forced myself to focus. The vibration seemed strongest near the far wall, where the rough-hewn stone met an unnervingly smooth patch, almost polished despite centuries of grime. I ran a gloved hand over it, expecting dampness or crumbling mortars, but found only the unsettling slickness. My fingers traced a faint pattern embedded in the stone, invisible at first glance, only revealed by the low angle of my light. It wasn't carving. It was more like a stain, or perhaps something that had grown into the rock itself, a dark. My fingers brushed against a section that felt subtly different. A seam, almost perfectly hidden. It ran vertically down the smooth patch. With trembling hands, I probed, pushing gently. There was a soft click, barely audible over the thrumming in my skull, and a narrow section of the wall swung inward, revealing not another passage, but a small, dark cavity. The air that spilled out was colder than the surrounding chamber, carrying a faint, metallic temph that caught in my throat. Inside, nestled on a ledge of raw rock, lay a single object. It was a sphere, no larger than my fist, crafted from a material I couldn't immediately identify. It wasn't stone nor metal, I knew. It was dark, almost black, but seemed to absorb the lantern light rather than reflect it, giving it a depth that felt infinite. As I reached for it, the vibrating intensified, and the dark filigree on the wall seemed to pulse with a faint internal light dot. My fingers closed around the sphere. It was unnervingly cold, a deep, penetrating cold that went beyond mere temperature. It felt dead, yet simultaneously humming with that same ancient energy. As I held it, fragmented images flickered at the edge of my mind, not memories, but impressions, vast, silent spaces, immense pressure, and a sense of profound. It wasn't the meticulous record-keeping of the monastery's official chronicles I'd been studying. This was a personal account, written in a shaky hand, filled with rambling observations and increasingly frantic entries. The author, identified only as Brother Thomas, seemed to have been a monk here centuries ago. His early entries spoke of strange dreams, but one entry, dated roughly 400 years prior, sent a fresh wave of dread through me that promised knowledge beyond God's grace. But then, a conflicting passage just pages later, the elder says it is a lie, a trick of the old ones. He says the orb is not a heart, but a key, and that to hold it is to invite the lock to turn. He speaks of a pact, broken, long ago, and of the price of its reawakening. A key, a lock. And who was this elder? The journal abruptly ended mid-sentence on the next page. The ink smeared, as if the writer had been interrupted violently. The cold sphere in one hand and the brittle journal in the other, the pieces didn't fit. A heart, a key. Two wildly different interpretations from the same small community centuries ago. It wasn't just that the secrets were reaching out, they were whispering contradictory lies, weaving a web of confusion designed to ensnare. The thrumming grew louder, more insistent. The darkness in the cavity seemed to deepen, coalescing into something more than just shadow, and I felt a distinct shift in the air, as if something vast and unseen had just drawn a slow, cold breath. The archives are now sealed. The full truth may never be known, leaving only whispers and shadows in the pages of history. Some stories are best left buried.